After the fall of political correctness, a bloody and vigorous struggle will commence for the narratives that will replace it. And as things look right now, that vigorous struggle will be almost exclusively inside the right wing of the political spectrum, because only the right has enough intellectual diversity within its ranks to even aspire to have such a struggle. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, I promised you a video going in great details on narratives. Now that video will come by the end of this month or something to that effect. Take this one as a precursor where we draw a small sketch of the things. Basically, there are a few axioms that need to be internalized, and this is particularly for those who watch this channel and are still idealists. So, axiom number 1. In any moment of history, the overwhelming majority of the populace in any given country believed in a narrative. Whether be it Christianity, Islam, Ragnarok, it doesn't really matter. The narrative is a set of stories about who you are, where you are, why are you the way you are, and where you're heading towards. And this narrative leads to a script. Now the script is the scenario by which the life of the average person is supposed to flow. Axiom number 2. Almost all of the time, the narrative was superimposed upon the majority of the populace in any given country or area by an elite. Now, that superimposition could be by force, like it happened with Islam in Persia, or Christianity in the former Viking Empire, by revolution, like it happened with socialism in France via the French Revolution and the Red Terror, or by persuasion, like it happened with the American liberty-minded system at the end of the Independence War. Either way, it's always a tiny elite that does the thinking. The people just follow. The existence of an elite is unavoidable. Axiom number 3. Dissent is unavoidable. There will always be people that don't go along with whatever prevailing narratives reigns on an era. History shows us that no matter how one chooses to deal with dissenters, they still never disappear. Even North Korea still has dissenters. 60 years of mass executions and relentless oppression still hasn't rid the place of dissenters. Axiom number 4. Regardless of method, a narrative takes 20 to 50 years to truly shift. This is basically an expansion to Andrew Breitbart's politics is 20 years downstream from culture postulate. Yes, politics is downstream from culture. Now you can argue whether it's 20 years or less, but narratives are even further downstream. Take any example from history of a turning point and then look downstream for the following 50 years. What you will notice is that in the first 10 years after that particular turning point, almost nothing had really changed in practice. Then another 10 years when the change finally becomes apparent and accelerates, and then another 10 years when it's finally getting clear that the change is permanent. And then after 30 to 35 years have passed, you can really talk about the prevalence of the new narrative. Let's take a few examples. Let's take more obscure examples. I mean, I could take the civil rights movement in the United States, but that's easy. Let's take the unification of Italy. Today we take it for granted that Italy is one country, but that wasn't always the case. When the process that eventually would lead to Italian unification began in 1815, the idea was outright lunacy. The idea of Italian unification was, for the most part, pushed from outside of Italy. Intellectuals in exile advocated for it. Well, that and the Italian Freemasonry with blackjack and hookers. Actual Freemasons were repressed and discredited because they had French connections. So the intellectual torch of Italian nationalism was carried by a group called the Carbonari, which were essentially Italian Freemasons who didn't call themselves Freemasons and didn't wear funny skirts or used funny temples. But basically, they were Masons. Anyway, the whole process includes a very long stream of revolutions, short-lived Roman republics, yes, Roman Republic in the 19th century, it's a fascinating episode of history, really, 3 independence wars, and many, many plots. The whole thing took over 50 years, from 1815 until 1871. Yet, after the unification, there was still very little talk about the Italian people. Why? Because just like Massimo d'Azeglio said after unification, l'Italia è fatta, restano da fare gli italiani. Italy has been made, now Italians need to be made. By 1900, 30 years after the unification, the narrative of a united Italian people was just still not there. It only became normative opinion after World War I, 50 years after the fact. The lingering post-unification discontent became truly extinct only after World War II. Let's take another example. Let's take one by force, such as the imposition of Soviet communism on any country you want from Eastern Europe, because all had a very similar trajectory. When Soviet Bolshevism was imposed by force in between 1945 and 1948, for several years to follow, things hadn't changed much. Sure, there were reprisals and whatnot, but these were quite common at the time anyway. There were reprisals in the former Western Bloc too. I mean, Norway executed quite a few people under allegations of collaborationism. So did France. But by and large, the feel of Soviet Bolshevism was not yet cemented. The vast majority of people hadn't changed. Then came the serious reprisals, the gulags, the secret arrests, and all the rest. This lasted till 1953, when Stalin died, and then the policies from Moscow softened both within the USSR and in the satellite countries, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and so on and so forth. I will ignore Hungary for a minute here, because the 1956 uprising made Hungary a special case. The point is that the collectivization process, although formally commenced in 1949, really started to kick off after mid-1950s, and the new communist narrative really did become normative in late 1970s and early 1980s, 30 to 35 years into the period of Soviet communism. Again, except Hungary, where things were a bit more complicated. And even so, the second there was a breach in the Reign of Terror, such as the 1968 Czech uprising, this did happen. The commie narrative became normative over 30 years, over 3 decades of repression, and it needed even a bit more than that just to even cement itself in the Central and Eastern European part of the continent. Or at least to appear to be cemented, because as the chain of revolutions of 1989 has shown, it was still not entirely cemented. I guess making everyone equally poor and having them starve while praising Lenin isn't such a fantastic way of selling the religion of egalitarianism. Anyway, the point of these 2 examples is to show that the 4 axioms actually do apply impeccably. You can take any example you want of a turning point in history and then look carefully in the next 30 to 50 years after that turning point. You will always find almost the exact same pattern, namely that the turning point needed at least 30 years to become normative. Now sure, some of the shifts in narrative get cemented faster, but by and large, the rule stands with remarkably little variation from topic to topic. The same will be true now. As the narrative of political correctness collapses, it will take another 30 years until that collapse will have been cemented. Over the next 10 to 15 years, there will be minor changes. The real political changes will be 20 to 25 years from now, and the new societal order will be cemented in 2050, or 2040 in the most optimistic scenario, assuming no serious war occurs and assuming technology maintains a similar path that it had in the last 15 years. Between now and 2040, so 23 years, there will be a struggle for the new narrative. Something will have to replace the political correctness, and something will replace political correctness. And that something will most likely come from the right, or maybe I should say from the non-left. And here's why. Currently, on the left, there are three narratives that fight for dominance: the classical commies, the Bernie Sanders type of commies, and the François Fillon type of leftists. None of these three stand any chance of becoming culturally dominant in the next 20 years. It's just not going to happen. Of these three, the only ones who aren't low energy are the Bernie Sanders type of commies. Now, mind you, I use Bernie Sanders solely as an archetype. This categorization fits Europe too. The problem with this faction is that it's childish, not just philosophically, I mean all leftism is childish, but demographically. There aren't many 40-year-old Bernie Sanders type of leftists out there, and that's not by accident. As individuals grow up, they tend to be cured of leftist idealism quite fast. Most of them end up running away from the left altogether, but even those that don't, they definitely moderate themselves quite a lot. On the non-left, but not necessarily the right, reside those who maintain leftist collectivist thinking but combine it with old-fashioned authoritarianism and some occult nonsense, trying to craft a narrative. Here we can include Duginism, white nationalism, black nationalism, most of the alt-right, and a few other smaller groups. Now mind you, these factions don't like each other at all, and they are themselves minuscule. Duginism is the most dangerous of all insofar as it's well-financed and can make a lot of damage in its attempt to become dominant, but it won't become dominant in the end. Nevertheless, it will die trying because it's an apocalyptic narrative, very much akin to Wahhabi Islam. Speaking of Wahhabi Islam and other forms of militant Islam, this one should fall under the category of allies of convenience for leftists. They're not leftists per se, but they share common interests with the left and also share the collectivist way of thinking. On the right, on the other hand, things are very high energy, so let me quickly run through all of the factions. I said earlier that most of the alt-right falls on the non-left category of those who maintain leftist collectivist thinking, but combine it with old-fashioned authoritarianism and some occult nonsense, trying to craft a narrative. That's because the alt-right is, in itself, quite diverse. The very traditionalist elements of it dissent quite a lot from the median insofar as they do not fall into collectivist thinking. An example of this would be the Davis-Orini type of people who are into free markets and are not into racism to the same extent, and tone down the collectivism quite a lot, provided that you Deus vult. That's broadly speaking, of course. Besides these, there are of course the establishment conservatives, or caxervatives, the John McCains of the world, the Theresa Mays of the world, the Angela Merkels of the world, the Nicolas Sarkozys of the world, and so on and so forth. Sure, we can argue that these kinds of people may very well be leftists, and it's an argument that I definitely do entertain, but what I mean by naming them here is to name the ideas behind them and the average people who do identify with them and think of themselves as part of the wider right. Then, of course, there is the religious right, which in itself is a whole tent. The Catholic right is not the same with the evangelical right. In Europe, there's also the Orthodox right, which again is split between the Constantinople right and the Moscow right, the latter being Duginist in essence. The religious right, although much less influential now than 25 years ago, is still a solid bloc on the right, and ignoring them would be a mistake. A mistake just as big as giving the religious right absolute reverence, a mistake committed in the 80s and 90s, which made the right afraid to appear in culture for almost 2 decades. The fourth is the libertarians, constitutionalists, preppers, and so on and so forth, the radical individualists, basically. This bloc is much stronger in the United States than it is in Europe, but nevertheless, it is there. The fifth block is basically my people, the libertarian conservatives, those who are individualist but not to the point of let's abolish the military because it's socialism type of individualists. This contingent is bigger than the fourth contingent, and I would argue that in size it's only second to the religious right. Now, mind you, this group of course includes religious people too. The difference is that this group doesn't use religion to promote ideas. One good example of such people is Ben Shapiro, who makes it an explicit point in his advocacy to always use secular arguments and says that the religious right are the worst spokespeople for their causes. And he's not wrong, you know. The sixth group is the old conservatives. Now, this one has a bit of overlap with the religious right, but not by much. What differentiates this group from the religious right is their radicalism and also their inconsistency on religion. Some members of this group do emphasize religion quite harshly, such as the Church Militant, which is a fundamentalist Catholic group based in Michigan, which outright advocates for a Catholic theocracy on the premise that the best system is a benevolent dictatorship under God. Other groups are less keen on theocracy per se, but still do think some sort of aristocratic dictatorship is better, with an emphasis on hierarchy, tradition, and duty. Now, the name Old Conservatives is a misnomer in a way because these people aren't exactly old. They're remarkably young and high energy too. This group makes up at least 5% of the modern right. Also, keep in mind that each of these 6 categories has its own subcategories that I won't get into because I would rather keep this video shorter. Besides these 6, there are also much smaller groups that don't exactly fit into one of the top 6, such as the special interests groups. A few examples of those, let's say the log cabin Republicans, the black conservatives, the immigrant conservatives, and so on and so forth. These are basically groups that otherwise do fit into one of the 6 categories, but they also have an element of special interest, such as the advancement of fags, the advancement of blacks, or some narrative about immigrants in the case of immigrant conservatives. Now, each of these groups have their own worldview and trade-offs. The existence of these groups is also why you will never see unity on the right, which is fine. The right is meant to be intellectually diverse. But this diversity also means different trade-offs. For instance, while the libertarian conservatives do agree with the religious right that the state should not intervene if a religious business refuses to, let's say, serve gay weddings, they will agree based on entirely different principles. They're identical on policy on this issue, but the rationale to get there is quite different. And while this doesn't matter in practical politics, it does matter quite a lot for this larger talk on narratives. It matters if a future government decides to scrap all these nonsensical laws because economic freedom and freedom of association matter more, or because it decrees that religious folk get an inherent privilege. And this is why I think the narrative of the future will come from somewhere on the right. Now, I don't know which one will be the result, and nobody knows, and nobody can know at this point. But the right is the only one capable of producing enough diversity of thought that struggles against each other to produce a new narrative. That is why culture matters. That is why it is important which narrative will win out. Now, I'm not saying that we should all start thinking about narratives tomorrow. We still have to crush political correctness into the dust, but what I am saying is that we should keep an eye on this a bit more. In the video where I mocked Emma Watson's depression, I also made a very serious point. I said then that when you shatter someone's narrative, with reference to people who come out from the cult of feminism, you'd better come up with a replacement, especially if you shatter such a profound narrative. This is a lesson that secularists in general should have learned too, but they didn't. When the clutches of the church's narrative were shattered, the secularists didn't have a replacement prepared. So the people latched on to the next religion available. Some latched on to feminism, others to wider Marxism, others to Eastern religious practices such as yoga or some other pseudoscientific crap, and so on and so forth. Let us not repeat the same mistake. The left is a cult whose narrative is dying. When the floodgates will be opened, and they will, we'd better have something to replace it really, really fast. But not with one alternative, rather with several who merely incorporate elements of the same narrative. Now, how to do this and what are my own ideas on this topic, well, I'll have to leave that for a future, longer video. This is an immensely complex topic and also atypical for this channel, so please do let me know in the comments if you'd like to see more of this type of content. Basically, in a future video, I will want to go into every desirable alternative narrative and how to develop the script too, because as I said at the beginning in axiom number 1, the narrative must lead to a script, and that script would have to be a bit more unified, really, to draw from more than one narrative so it can satisfy enough people to still have trust and a social fabric, basically. The point of this endeavor is quite simple. The post-PC world will have to be open-minded, but without allowing its brains to fall out like it happens today. And this is not complicated, mind you. It is simple, but not easy, as the saying goes. And it has been done successfully in the past as well. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. Leftists try to reinvent the wheel, and we see the results. Better outcomes are possible, provided that more attention is being paid and human nature is not ignored, like leftists do. Anyway, with all of that being said, thank you for watching, thank you for your continuous and generous support, and I'll see you around on Freedom Alternative.